Hello and welcome to AI Curious. My name is Jeff Wilser. I'm a journalist, I'm a human, and I am curious about AI. So today's episode is something of a course correction for the podcast. Or if not correction, then at least a clarification. There's a reason I say I'm AI curious and not an AI champion or AI enthusiast or AI Kool-Aid drinker. I do find it fascinating, but that's for reasons that are both good and bad. Its potential is staggering, and so are the risks. So I've always intended this podcast to explore and unpack the risks and concerns. To this point, we've pretty much focused just on the upsides and cool stuff on AI. And yeah, we'll be doing that a lot more in the future too. But today we're gonna go dark. Today we're going to get real. Today, we're going to get into the sober AI risks and what we could and should do about them. And also, what does America think about this? How does this fit into the political policy landscape? Is it a Democrat or Republican issue? We'll unpack all of that. And to help us make sense of this, I've invited on Daniel Colson, the executive director of the AI Policy Institute, which is focused on helping policymakers create smart and effective regulation. The AI Policy Institute recently conducted a poll asking basically, what do Americans think about AI? How worried are they? Are they more excited or fearful? Do they want regulation? Spoiler alert, the polls clearly show that yes, across this political spectrum, Americans do want AI regulation, and we'll get to all of that. So the great thing about Daniel is that he can see both sides of this. He started his career in tech research and tech entrepreneurship, and he generally has a pro-tech bias. This context is important because often AI safety advocates are kind of caricatured as doomsdayers or even Luddites. That's not Daniel. He's generally pro-tech, but for him, something about AI is different. We cover a lot of ground here on how Daniel's thoughts on AI have evolved, and then what he sees as the main categories or kind of buckets of risks for AI. And we spend some good time here because I think, again, kind of AI safety advocates are often just lumped into some category of, oh, you're worried about the Terminator or Skynet, or HAL from 2000. And those are colorful examples, but there's a lot more nuance in the potential for AI risk and AI going sideways. And Daniel gets into that as opposed to just using some broad brush of it could go crazy on us. So I'm glad we spent some time fleshing out what could truly go wrong. And he shares what he's learned from polling, what Americans think about AI, and finally, what good regulation should look like. And then finally, we go there. Given all of this, should humanity even be trying to open this Pandora's box at all? Wherever you are on the AI optimism or AI pessimism spectrum, or framed differently, the let's build AI aggressively camp or the let's slow the F down camp, I think Daniel's insights are a crucial perspective to consider. So please enjoy my conversation with Daniel Colson, Executive Director of the AI Policy Institute. Daniel, it's great to have you on. Let's jump right into the inflection or pivot point, if you will. You began your career studying things like how technology can positively benefit the world. And you've been a tech entrepreneur. You're generally pro-tech. So what nudged you to take this new direction of your career, focusing on AI risks and the AI Policy Institute?
I think when I look at kind of the history of technology overall, I think I have a pretty rosy picture of how it's gone overall for humanity. Almost, I think it's a little similar to Steven Pinker, that, you know, sanitation has been awesome. In a lot of ways, transportation and communication technology is awesome. Everyone is an
There's less
information
hunger.
trillier. There's less hunger. But I think by kind of every measure that you can think of for how is the average human doing, I think there's a lot of evidence that in a lot of ways humanity's gone way better off than it used to be, and that technology has been the driver of that. Since the Industrial Revolution.
I think from a super wide lens view, I completely agree. So why is this different? So why is AI something that you're like, huh? Let's pause.
I think if you suddenly have a really good machine intelligence, a machine intelligence that can really do all of the things that a human intelligence can do. It can reason, it can execute long-term plans. You can tell it to try to start a business, and it'll do its best. You can do all of the things like that. You know, I think the thing that immediately becomes relevant and that my attention goes to is has intelligence been used for competition for power, and how
Hmm.
will innovation on the frontier of intelligence transform the way that intelligence is used for power. You know, I think throughout all of history, you see states competing over great scientists and great engineers as, a critical component of state policy. I think Werner von Braun is a really good example of this. You know, I mean, he was a Nazi, but we were kind of willing to overlook that because he was a really good rocket scientist.
For the listener, von Braun, who, and let me know if I'm getting my facts wrong here, who had at the very least Nazi ties, is fair to say, and then in the 50s, I'm not sure when it started, but the U.S. Is part of Operation Paperclip. Is
Yeah,
that
so Werner von Braun is a German physicist and a rocket physicist, and under the Nazi regime, he's running their rocket research program, which very famously led to the development of the V1 and V2 rockets, which were
Mhm.
used to bombard London from Germany. In 19, I think the first ones were shot in 1944, 1945. So then, immediately following the war in Operation Paperclip, there was a lot of competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union to recruit former Nazi scientists and engineers, and so von Braun was brought to the United States to work for the U.S. rocket research programs, and ended up being, the lead scientist for the development of the Saturn V rocket, which was used for, the key Apollo missions.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, arguably the most critical figure in the U.S.'s triumph in the space race is literally a Nazi.
that's right. That's right.
It's imagine that happening
Yeah.
today in the era of Twitter/X. But anyway,
So
fascinating
yeah. So I think that shows
subplot.
how immense intelligence. The ability for to think like this has always been an incredibly scarce resource that states compete over.
Right. So getting back to our topic here,
Yeah,
imagine if von Braun, we had the intelligence of a von Braun in AI in ChatGPT 9, right?
that's
So
right.
what does that mean? And in our case in the US, von Braun was, I think most would argue and agree, that was a relatively benign. I mean, I'm up my cards on the table. I'm personally very pro space exploration.
Uh huh.
So I am
Yeah,
delighted that we landed on the moon. I have no qualms about that.
me
I'm
too.
very happy. I'm very happy that the US did that, right? So in that case, using intelligence for good. But it's easy to imagine worlds where von Braun and von Braun plus level intelligence is used for ill. So maybe with that kind of backdrop, now let's kind of pivot into what are some of your specific concerns about um, AI safety, and then maybe to back up a bit, how do you, I think it's good to establish that, okay, a AI safety, folks coming at it from an AI safety perspective are not Luddites. They're not like, oh, we hate tech. We just want to see us with plows and shovels, right? Um, there is, at least in your case, a very strong pro tech appreciation. and there's a larger concern about AI. And I think a lot of folks listening to this podcast, like me, are generally aware that, okay, there's AI risks. And maybe we've heard of, there's a scenario of, okay, like we all know that from the movies, that like the Skynet Terminator scenarios,
Hmm.
right? There's
Hmm.
that. But I'd love to bridge from this kind of abstract, what frankly sounds sensational and like overreact at first blush might sound like, guys, get a little carried away, worried about Skynet
Hmm.
and Terminator, right?
Hmm.
So let's bridge from that kind of like sci-fi horror concern into, I mean, you're obviously a very, very smart guy with a very nuanced appreciation of a tech. I mean, you freaking studied how tech impacts the world. So I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on what are the main buckets of AI risk and AI downsides that concerns you. And it's a long-winded question,
Hmm.
but I'll let you tackle that however you see fit.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great question. So, I guess I would kind of break it into a few different categories where there's maybe cause for significant concern. So the first is what you could describe as like malicious use. So it's
Mm-hmm.
basically someone taking new AI tools and just trying to cause as much harm as possible. That's kind of one category.
A terrorist group, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. Where I think there's kind of a concern that you develop a new tool, you open source it, and unintentionally cause what used to require maybe $10 million and a state backed bio program to produce a certain result. Now maybe you can do it for $100,000, and you only really need
Yeah.
a biological
Yeah.
undergrad bio degree.
Right.
Things like that, where suddenly the burden, the difficulty of not having people do this becomes much, much harder. So that's kind of
And
malicious use.
crucially, yeah, got it. And this doesn't require quote unquote AGI. This doesn't
No,
require, like, that doesn't mean that AI has to become some god level tech. It could just be even what we have now or a little better. And if some kind of like terrorist group uses that to do terrorist plus things, that's a bad outcome.
that's the
So
thing.
yeah,
Exactly. I
yeah,
kind of think of this as like every time that we create new tech, you know, kind of the things that we can do advances, and that kind of exposes new vulnerabilities in the system that we have, and you need to kind of rebuild the walls in a sense.
all right. So that's the first that's the first category.
Yep.
What's the next one?
So next one, think of this as you know AI race dynamics. Basically, that where you have competitive actors that are using very powerful AI systems to race and compete against each other, and that leads to some sort of notable destructive outcome. I think uh,
Mm-hmm.
I've spent a lot of time studying lethal autonomous weapons, and so there's easy to imagine scenarios in autonomous warfare that that are along these lines.
I can kind of imagine two subcategories of awfulness here.
Uh-huh.
One of which is that the weapons themselves get better and more dangerous.
Yep.
So, just whenever you have, just like nukes, whenever you have more potent bombs and weapons, that's kind of um, net. That's not great for the world, right? There's
Yeah.
more risk of loss of life and awful shit happening.
Yeah.
And the second subcategory is if you are injecting AI into the military decision making, right? So
Yeah.
if we say, hey, actually, you know what? Just as AI is really good at solving some kind of like engineering puzzle, it's really good at looking at a map of a battlefield, doing all of the cost benefit analysis, looking at risks of certain battles being won, and then makes the calls of who's living and who's dying.
I think there, with weapon systems like that, and the technology you're describing is similar to the Palantir's AIP system that's being used by the Ukrainian military in the war in
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine for the last couple of years. Um, you know, I think that there's a race dynamic with weapon systems like this, which is that if it gives you a big enough advantage on the battlefield, your opponents really have to adopt the technology. And
Mhm.
that's the reason why, with every new war, and in a big way with the war in Ukraine, people have been watching very carefully to see, what weapons systems are proving relevant and newly decisive.
I just add one more bit of nuance here. I should add a clarification. This doesn't seem like a simple call to me, right? Because
Uh-huh.
if the military can demonstrate that using a system like this makes a fighting unit that's more effective and saves lives of their side, that's hard to argue with. Like, to be not to be melodramatic, if I am the mother or father of a US soldier or any country, a
Mm-hmm.
soldier that's fighting some war, and I'm told that this AI system is helpful at making it more likely our side can win
Mm-hmm.
without my son or daughter being killed in battle, then I'm all for it, right? So um, I don't have the answer here. I'm just acknowledging that this is. I think the risk that
Definitely.
you're highlighting is super fair and appropriate to acknowledge. This is a risk of if the world gets more dangerous. I also can see the argument that if there is a war, if we're going to be fighting a war, then it's almost you almost have an obligation to use the best tools we have to win the war. And if AI is one of those tools, so be it.
No question about it.
Complicated stuff.
And,
Yeah.
and along those lines, I think that America maintaining its, you know, technologically dominant stance in the world and maintaining the, uh, you know, world order and system of rules and, norms that have operated since World War II. I think that that's really important and really positive. And, you know, to sort of totally sacrifice that for the sake of risks, I think would be a big, you know, a big mistake.
Yeah. Yeah. What other AI risks or other kind of buckets of AI risk concern you and keep you up at night?
I think there's another general category that a lot of people worry about, which is something like, um, you develop a very powerful AI, it starts to improve and advance itself, and then kind of goes rogue, you could say.
Mm-hmm.
In some sense, and so this is, I think, what a lot of people think of as the classic, like paperclip maximizer scenario given in
Daniel,
the.
can you define? It's one of my favorite kind of AI nuggets out there. But for
Yeah.
listeners who are just now tuning into this issue, please, if you will, define the classic AI paperclip scenario.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So the classic AI paperclip scenario is basically, that you create a very powerful AI system that has some sort of arbitrary goal, like maximize the number of paperclips in the universe. And, you know, it sort of doesn't matter how stupid the goal is, but you kind of give this super powerful, ultra intelligent system this goal. And then it starts to kind of try to do everything that it can to maximize the number of paperclips in the universe. And the idea is that, it starts to basically try to use all atoms in the universe to turn into paper clips, and your body contains some atoms, and so if it happens to use your body in order to produce paper clips, then it doesn't really have anything against you necessarily. It's just you're useful for its paperclip maximizing
In its
process.
mind, it's the hero, its own story. It's the paperclip heroes. It is doing its damnedest to make paperclips.
The key thing that I think this is meant to illustrate is something called the orthogonality thesis. Basically, that, kind of the goals of a system can be totally arbitrary relative to its capabilities. So, in some sense,
Hmm.
humans are like a system that's optimized to have sex with other humans and like find food, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But in the process of biology and evolution optimizing for those things, we evolved a brain and a neocortex that allows us to do extremely complex planning and invent all these technologies. It's basically you can be optimizing for something really silly, like create paper clips, or like find mates, but then that can produce unbelievably complicated sort of mechanisms like the human brain, or like these convergent goals and
Right.
intelligences.
And as part of the idea here, a kind of unspoken part of this concern is that, yes, this is unlikely, right? No one's thinking it's like we're most likely on track to develop this paperclip hell scenario or the Ultron scenario. But the risk is not zero. And so, given the potential downside, it's worth not ignoring entirely. And we can debate what that percentage is. Is it
Hmm.
zero, or is it 0.1%? Is it 1%? Is it 5%, 10%, 20%, 50%? I think reasonable people can debate how likely this kind of doomsday scenario is, but it's worth putting on the board, at the very least, considering and discussing how we should think about guardrails around it. Am I framing that appropriately?
Yeah, I think totally. And I think one of the big questions that is on the table is, how powerful will these systems be in the relatively short run? Where um, uh, where you know uh, I think a lot of the real concern comes from I think the example of AlphaFold is useful to consider in this case, where AlphaFold was a model that was published by DeepMind,
Hmm.
owned by Google, um, and essentially what it does is predict the 3D structure of proteins on the basis of its amino acid sequence, which is classically there's kind of a classic problem known as the protein folding problem, where basically uh, in order to understand the function of a protein, you need to understand the three-dimensional structure of the protein. But it's really difficult to determine the three-dimensional structure of a protein just on the basis of its sort of sequencing the
Right.
protein.
Right.
Where proteins are made of the sequence of the amino acids, so you can figure out the 3D structure on the basis of the amino acid sequence, but it's really hard. So
Hmm.
so until the publication of AlphaFold, I, uh, I hope I'm getting this right, but I think it was about 12% of the human proteome, basically of all proteins in the human body, were it was the 3D structure was known. And so
Hmm.
in 2021, DeepMind publishes AlphaFold, which is basically the remaining 88% of the human proteome solved
Wow.
in sort of one open source publication that you can download, just the file, you know, and what's amazing is, you know, their first 12% of progress happened because biochemistry PhD students over the course of 50 years would use methods like uh, electron microscopes, trying to sort of
Hmm.
directly observe the 3D structure of proteins, things like that, where they'd spend their whole PhD trying to understand the structure of one protein, now sort of instantly of the rest. I think that is a great illustration of the way that automation of intelligence, I think in this case, it's kind of the automation of pattern recognition in a very
Hmm.
narrow context. But automation of pattern recognition and intelligence can lead to really sudden and totally
Yeah.
transformative sort of pieces of progress. So now I think the question that I ask is, and I think I'm worried about, and where I think a lot of, I think the expectation of immense change comes from, is what happens when we do that for physics in 2026? You know,
Hmm.
if you get a general intelligence that can do things like scientific research, and especially if it can do, let's say you have, a program, von Neumann.exe on your computer, and it runs, John von Neumann, who a lot of people think
Hmm.
of as sort of the
Hmm.
classic example of a modern genius. Um, you know, there's a bunch of features of that, which is you can easily run another 1,000 copies of it because it's on the computer. So you can just, rent more cloud space. You can, probably, if your hardware gets better, if your hardware gets twice as good over the course of 3 years or something, now suddenly maybe the intelligence has gotten significantly better. Also, if your models are
Mm-hmm.
getting better, so suddenly you have this intelligence on the computer that's scalable and getting dramatically better.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and uh, uh, you know, uh, I think this is where you get this kind of opening of Pandora's box dynamic,
Yeah.
where suddenly you have a machine intelligence that can maybe discover all knowledge, or at least a
Mm-hmm.
huge amount of scientific knowledge that hasn't typically been accessible, um, because because it's reached this level of quality intelligence and also automation of intelligence. I think there's an expectation that will be a really profound change. That
Right. And there's one scenario where it slash we collaborate to achieve that and unlock that intelligence. And we're like, awesome. Humanity just leveled up. We know
mhm,
things we didn't know before, which for obvious reasons enriches us all in ways we can't now fathom. There's other scenario that the AI unlocks this and has this almost privileged information
mhm.
that we don't even have and can exploit it to its own ends. Got it. I want to make sure that we cover the full board of risks and concerns for you. And this is we could talk for 3 hours on
I
the
know. Yeah.
the
There's a
truly
lot of rabbit
doomsday
holes with all
stuff, and
this.
that's the sexy stuff. I know, but briefly, what are the kind of the rest of the main categories of AI risks and concerns that you think about that are high in your mind?
Yeah, so just to reiterate, so we're going over just a couple different categories. So we talked about malicious use, by like a terrorist organization. We talked about race dynamics between states. We talked about rogue AIs like a super intelligence that sort of goes off the rails, the paperclip scenario. I think another one to think about is what I describe as kind of um, uh, organizational risks. So uh, basically, uh, organizations go about trying to uh, uh, develop AI significantly faster because they think it'll be safe, and then that leads to some notable catastrophe. Sort of like
Mm-hmm.
some of the big catastrophes that we've seen with nuclear energy in Chernobyl,
Mm-hmm.
3 Mile Island, Fukushima. The sort of thing where you develop the technology, you do it in a manner that you think is responsible and reasonable, but then it sort of backfires, and
Mm-hmm.
you end up having organizations that are trying. You sort of end up having a lot of risk with the organizations managing the development of that technology.
Got it. And I'm going to throw two of my own out there into this kind of risk cauldron. Um, and I'm sure it's on your radar too, obviously. Deep fakes, misinformation. I guess it's less of a risk and more of a known. I guess you're describing possible risks in the future.
Mm-hmm.
This is a known evil already.
Yeah,
We're already in this world of
absolutely.
deep fakes. And I personally, for me, this one terrifies me in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, everything you described, I am already kind of, um, uh, while I have a generally a optimistic view of the world, I am generally believe that we are better off now than 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And I believe that 10 years from now, better off. Wide lens, I believe that. The fact we live in a society where objective truth has been almost shattered, I
Mm-hmm.
find deeply depressing. I see no good solution there. And then you throw in the rocket fuel and gasoline of AI deepfakes and how that will be used in elections and weaponized and to exploit people. I find that personally pretty concerning. And then, of course, the elephant in the room here that a lot of folks are worried about, and I'm guessing we'll get to this on your poll results, is job loss, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how will AI impact the economy? How will, even if it is some, as Sam Altman has said in the past, he thinks that ultimately it will be a great thing for humanity and the economy. It will lead to economic progress overall,
Mm-hmm.
but there will be quote unquote disruptions in the short and medium term. And quote unquote disruptions, a
Uh-huh.
hell of a euphemism, potentially millions and millions of people losing their jobs.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to trivialize that. Any other key categories you want to highlight before we kind of pivot to what you and the AI Policy Institute has learned as far as how Americans are thinking about AI now?
Yeah. Well, I guess just briefly a comment on the deep fakes and the
Yeah.
that that component. I think there's a real concern that you can kind of see a falling apart of the information commons and kind of shared reality that we live
Mm-hmm.
in. There, Tristan Harris at the Center for Humane Technology characterizes social media as sort of humanity's first contact with AI. Where there are these
Hmm.
AI recommendation algorithms that are having a big effect on society and culture. Um, I think something that no one really expected was that a news feed would be able to take out 30% of the population or something into sort of like a
Yeah.
total hole of addiction. I think
Yeah.
I really didn't expect that to be more addicting than television. Um, and so I think that that's an illustration of how very simple things that look very simple can really kind of hijack humans.
Absolutely. Thank you for giving us a lay of the land of some of the key risks and concerns
Mhm.
to think about. Let's turn to what you've learned. And first, tell us a bit about the AI Policy Institute. What are its goals and what have you learned so far?
Absolutely, yeah. So the AI Policy Institute, we're a recently founded think tank focusing on AI policy issues and also public opinion research. Basically, trying to kind of bring uh, the kind of American voter and American public opinion into the picture for how AI should be developed and how we should be thinking about this technology. Um, you know, I think there's generally speaking, technology is developed in the U.S. by technologists and kind of technology
Mm-hmm.
companies, but at the same time, we're a democracy, and in a sense, we want the most important societal choices that we make to be made by ideally leaders that are accountable to the public and are taking the public's interests into account. And so,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in that sense, I think there's a big difference in preferences between technologists and the American public, which is technologists are really risk tolerant. They really like taking risks. Um,
Love risks.
love
Yes.
risk, because all the upside is in the risk in an important
Yes.
sense. Every entrepreneur knows that. And
And if they fail, so be it. Their capital fails.
that's
It's a
right.
risk to them, but not to humanity at large,
That's right.
generally.
And also, generally
Yeah.
speaking, when you create a new technology, even if it has harms to society, you're not held liable for the consequences of that technology. You can invent dynamite, but you're not responsible for all of the consequences of explosives. As a consequence, they're
Hmm.
going forward. You're not put
Mm-hmm.
in prison for other people using explosives to, do naughty things. And that's kind of the general stance that we've held for technology, that you're not liable in that way.
Which is, I think, in fairness, generally worked pretty well as far as being able to. And there's a reason why, many reasons certainly, but one reason many would argue the US has been such a leader in innovation
Mm-hmm.
is an environment that allows entrepreneurs to take these risks, incentivize it, and it has flourished. This often works pretty well.
That's right.
And I'm guessing where we're going with this is we're kind of in uncharted waters with this particular tech.
Well, I think the way that I kind of think of it is, with oil companies, there's a way in which they kind of externalize the consequences of carbon emissions, where they're able to get the profits from selling oil, but they don't have to pay for the consequences of climate change. With tech companies, they do the same thing with risk, in the sense that if
Hmm.
they develop technologies that have really negative consequences for society, they don't have to pay for that. It's kind of all of society that has to pay for those consequences, but they get all of the power and wealth as a consequence of creating the technology. I think in an important
Hmm.
sense, we've seen, I think that's kind of the dynamic that's played out with social media. Um,
Yeah.
and so, in a sense, the tech companies are able to externalize all of the risk that they're taking onto society, but get all of the benefit if the
And
risks pan out
internalize
well.
all the profits.
Internalize all of the profits,
Right.
and
Right.
in a certain sense, I think in a lot of times we're willing to tolerate that because the technological progress ends up being really positive, and so society ends up, having positive results from that. I think where it becomes different, is you can imagine a button, and let's say if you push the button, there's a 90% chance of utopia, where you live forever and there's infinite abundance, and a 10% chance that all life in the universe disappears. So I think most technologists have a personality where they'd push that button.
That would be a very fun survey of 100 people. How many people push that button or not,
Yeah,
and what that says about their personality.
yeah,
Fascinating.
and I think a big difference between technologists and the American public, and this is kind of getting to some of the polling research that we've done, is the American public is a lot more risk averse than technologists. So, one question that we asked was, uh, asking people. Some people say we should speed up AI because it'll make our lives happier and healthier. Others say it could be dangerous and the risks could, pose issues for the economy, and that we should move slowly. What do you think? So when you ask that to the American public, 82% say we should go slowly and deliberately, and 8% say we should speed up development. So, I think that generally points to the way in which I think the American public is hesitant when it comes to change.
What were some other takeaways from this poll you did?
Another big one is people are more concerned than they are excited about AI development. So, we asked, on the whole, thinking about AI, would you say you're more excited about growth or in artificial intelligence or more concerned? So when we ask that, we find that about 65% of registered Republicans say that they're concerned, whereas only about 17% of Republicans say that they're more excited. And then amongst Democrats, we see it's uh, uh, about 59% more concerned, and then 19% more excited.
That's not that different by a political party, and I kind of,
Uh huh.
frankly, kind of like that. I like that at
Exactly.
this point. At this point, so far, this has not yet been politicized, right? It's not yet a partisan issue. AI seems to be not fall cleanly upon the usual left-right divide.
That's exactly right. So, we're seeing that both Republicans and Democrats are really skeptical of the tech industry and tech companies, and that there's really strong bipartisan support for, regulatory proposals, creation of new federal agencies to regulate AI. It seems like AI is going to be maybe the new big bipartisan issue where Republicans and Democrats are really going to agree that big time legislation needs to happen in order to kind of shape the direction that the tech is going.
Man, I hope you're right because it doesn't seem to be any logical reason why one party should claim any side of this, right? It does
Mm-hmm.
seem like it doesn't fit along the usual ideological contours.
Mm-hmm.
That said, dude, I'm I'm skeptical of it. It feels like things that you would think shouldn't kind of cleave to any one side have a tendency to somehow do so. All it takes is one leader going strong in one direction of this, and I could just kind of I hope you're right. I hope it stays this way.
Yeah,
Anyway,
a lot of what we're seeing from voters, is that there's it's just a couple other questions that are interesting. So looking at different policy priorities. So we asked, should we restrict how powerful AI models can become. So should we restrict the power of AI models? And with that, we found 69% of Republicans and 67% of Democrats say we should restrict the power of AI
Hmm.
models with regulation. So, I think that kind of no matter how you ask these regulatory questions, there's a lot of appetite amongst voters from both sides, from both parties, to kind of have the government really step in to change the trajectory of the technology. I think there's a little bit less certainty, especially amongst elected officials, about exactly how to do that in the right way.
And we'll go there in a bit. As far
Yes.
as, okay, now what? What do we do? Anything else from the poll that you want to highlight?
Yeah, one other one that I want to highlight was, um, usually you'll see skepticism about kind of having a lot of federal involvement in uh, industries, especially amongst Republicans. We recently did
Mm-hmm.
a poll asking, would you support the creation of a new federal agency to regulate AI? And in that poll found 51% of Republicans supported that and only 15% were opposed. And so,
Wow.
I think the thing that you're seeing is, I think as soon as um, as AI capabilities advance, we're going to see AI become a really big political issue, and that's going to cause
Yeah.
it to become on the center of the plate for elected officials to do something about it. And I think that's when these polling numbers are going to be really important because I think it indicates that probably the political world is going to be very supportive of regulation. The American public is supportive of it, and I think that's the direction that kind of the political world is going to. And so that's kind of an important indication of where we're going from here.
That's a great segue. Let's go there now. Up until now, we've been discussing, largely speaking, the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Here are all many reasons why AI could be a problem. What are the risks? What does the public think about the risks? To summarize in an extremely reductive way, there are risks, the public's concerned, they want regulation. So,
Mm-hmm.
given all of that, what do you see as the solutions? What do you see as sensible regulation?
Mm-hmm.
Is regulation even is meaningful regulation? What even matter? I mean, I kind of think of this. My visual, I'm just making something to fly. Is like you have be putting paper guardrails on a racetrack that these cars can just blow through at 300 miles an hour, right? What if you could wave a magic wand, Daniel?
Mm-hmm.
What is some regulation you would like to see? What do you think the government could do?
So, I think the places where you'll see really beneficial regulations, I think, depend on kind of what the issues that you're trying to address are, which really comes down to a question of, what is the technology that we're going to get? And
Yeah.
I think there's a few different components to it. One very, very tractable area is, I think there are certain narrow models that will be pretty risky to have be publicly available. I think a lot of there's growing consensus that biological models that you can use to design novel molecules and things like that
Mm-hmm.
can really do some risky things, especially if you're able to create those things. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think one
So like
component of
virus GPT
yeah,
should be
virus GPT,
discouraged.
virus GPT. We really don't want virus GPT, especially if it's really easy. And
Right.
I think one angle of regulations will be there will be very particular narrow risks where there's a simple move that you can do to make it much safer. I think with biomodels in particular, it's monitoring the what new pathogens are created by the machines that can create them. This is something that's really positive, a very, very positive piece of regulations that doesn't even sort of limit the commercial applications of it really much at all.
Mm-hmm.
You know, from a totally different angle, though, I think a lot of the fundamental risk from the technology, I think, comes from how powerful it will be. and the fundamental
Yeah.
capabilities that come from it. So, a lot of people looking at regulation have suggested things like dangerous capability evaluations, where basically, if you make sure that you're only releasing the AIs that uh, you've you've proven to be safe by putting it through this sort of really exhaustive set of tests and trying to kind of prune its behavior. If you only release those AIs, and if you only create the safe ones, then maybe that's the way that you can keep AI safe overall.
I'm thinking the complicated thing is it's the very things that make it potentially dangerous that also make it potentially wildly useful and more likely to cure cancer, right?
That's
So
the
it's the
thing.
very, yeah. So if you're going to handcuff it from its danger potential, you're also handcuffing it from curing cancer, just to be shorthanded about this.
And in this sense, the reason why I'm not supportive of dangerous capability evaluations as a way to regulate AI is because the capabilities that the labs are trying to develop are the very dangerous capabilities that people are worried about. Where I think being able to do novel scientific research is a really good example of this, where, if suddenly you can have, kind of the rest of physics figured out on a laptop, you know, in a sense, is that a dangerous capability that it wasn't supposed to do, or something like that? It kind of did what it was supposed to do. It's just really consequential what it did.
Right. 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 Right.
um, so I think there's one big angle on regulation has been trying to basically focus on dangerous capability evaluations and only creating the safe AIs. I think the stance that I come down on is the real threat from AI is how powerful intelligence is. And the fact that,
Mm.
you know, this is a really simple way to think about it, but I think it points to the right thing. If in 2025 in March, the computer has an IQ of 150, and then it has an IQ of 160 a week later, and then 170 a week later, but then it's scaled
Mm.
across all of these, you know, machines doing scientific research to try to understand the sort of nature of reality, and then that gets pointed at developing weapon systems for interstate competition. You know, this is where you get the Pandora's box opening.
Oops.
Oops, dynamic. And where suddenly, like with AlphaFold, where you went from, we have 12% of the human proteome with human effort, suddenly you get the remaining 88%, published as a file that you can download. And so the thing that I say then for regulation is, if the risk is from the fundamental capabilities we're getting, then the way that regulation can be beneficial is by slowing down the pace that we're getting these new capabilities.
Instead of going from IQ of 150 to 160 to 170 in 3 weeks, if it's going slower to, if it's a 150 and then like 3 months later 160, that gives time to kind of open up the hood, make sure there's no potential for weapons systems being built, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Where I think there's a nice example with the development of nuclear energy and different generations of nuclear reactors as an illustration of how delay of development leads to a lot of safety progress without scaling up the danger. Where essentially since the 70s, the United States has pretty much had a pause on the further development of nuclear energy. But there's been a lot of fantastic research into nuclear reactor designs, wherein all of the major failures that have happened amongst nuclear reactors have been generation 2 model reactors. Most notably, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and Fukushima were all generation 2 reactors that failed due to what are now, of course, now known mechanisms. But since then, generation 3 and generation 4 nuclear reactors are a lot safer. And I think that kind of, and generally speaking, when you slow down the rate at which a system is changing, that makes it less likely that it's going to go off the
There are
rails.
those who would argue on the nuclear side that we've been overly cautious with nuclear technology and have not leaned into it as much as we could. And that's come with more reliance on fossil fuels. And if there was a world where we kind of embraced nuclear
Uh-huh.
clean energy, then perhaps we'd be in a better shape. So I could see that argument. I'm both from both angles there, but that's a whole other podcast, I'm sure.
I've always been mixed, in a funny way, mixed on this argument because, and I think it's also an amazing lesson because, in some sense, in discovering nuclear energy, we kind of discovered infinite energy. And it's kind of amazing that we put that back in the bottle in a major way. And the reason I think why we did that, and that also the reason why I've never really supported scaling nuclear energy, is because you can't avoid the nuclear weapons proliferation dynamics if you have an energy that's based upon nuclear materials. Where, if you have your entire world energy supply based upon nuclear energy, kind of a necessary consequence of that is that nuclear weapons proliferates to every state on Earth. And I think that's always seemed like too big of a risk from the nuclear proliferation side of things to be willing to have it seem like a good idea to actually go all in on nuclear energy. And I think that in that sense, nuclear energy is a pretty amazing example of a technology where there was incredible, unbelievable positive upside to its development, but we saw the risks, and I think especially there were really major national security risks from,
Mm-hmm.
scaling up nuclear energy. Also, there was a major public backlash against it that was very well coordinated politically at the time, and and um, I think you see, I think it's a phenomenal proof of possibility that technologies like this aren't inevitable, even when there's enormous economic forces
Mm.
stacked up behind it. You know, political will and the direction that people want technologies to go, ultimately, and especially for the critical technologies, and especially when it kind of the rubber meets the road with the technology in some sense. Um, you know, governance usually serves to be a more powerful force than technological inevitabilism in some sense.
That is a surprising, hopeful note. I love hearing that. As we wind, and we can speak about this for hours and hours and hours. I'd love to have you
Mhm.
back in the future as we wind this session down. What else would you want to see in regulation? And then, and you can take this whenever you'd like. Given all the risks, given that 90% utopia, 10% extinction button that you proposed, if regulation is fraught, and as you said, maybe there is hope, maybe we've demonstrated we can actually regulate and have smart governance, but
Mhm.
do you even want to see us continue at all, right? In your ideal worlds, should we be developing and moving forward with AI research at all? Is it inevitable? Would you prefer to see us say, hey guys, let's just close up shop? This is too much to deal with. It's too risky. So let's start first with remaining regulation you'd like to see, and then how do you view the should we or shouldn't we question?
Yeah, great. The thing that I think is key is that, and is I think the big problem with the current political conversation is that uh, we're going to have very powerful agentic intelligence systems, things like AGI in the next few years.
Yep.
That's what all of the leaders of the technology companies are saying. And, that's kind of the track that we're on. But unfortunately, AGI is kind of a taboo term and a taboo idea in basically all serious political rooms. In Washington, it's basically a taboo term amongst elected officials, and as a consequence, the technology that's being considered from a political perspective just isn't the technology that's dangerous and isn't even the technology that we're going to have 18 months from now. You know, you
So they're
know,
just focused on kind of smaller stakes, relatively things like
that's right.
ChatGPT and generative AI, and also not to minimize it, but on job loss stuff,
That's
right?
right.
And that's not to minimize people will lose their jobs, but that's so far as the politicians are thinking about, not thinking about the Pandora's box that you're describing.
And so the way this plays out is basically, uh, you know, right now funding for agency based and agent based startups in Silicon Valley is one of the biggest categories. There's hundreds of companies getting funding to specifically try to develop agents. That's kind of the next big wave of models that Google and OpenAI are going to release. And so, you know, I think that the big challenge will be for the regulatory conversation to catch up with how big a deal this technology is and how fast it's going to
Mm-hmm.
move. There's a nice characterization a nice line that I heard, which was, with exponential curves, there's only too early and too late.
Hmm.
And if we're on a super exponential curve with the development of machine intelligence, right now it looks way too early. But all of the AI researchers right now are saying, we're going to have this. We don't have it today. We definitely don't have it today, but it seems like we're going to have it like 18 months from now, 24 months from now. And so, right now it looks too early. All of the researchers and scientists are saying we're about to get this. And so I think right now is actually the moment when we really need to act, and um, and also I think be preparing for a big change that's coming. You know, and a big technological change that's different than things that we've seen.
I know we're just about out of time. So if I can put you on the spot and ask you, would you, given all of that, given all that we've outlined here,
Uh-huh.
should we be developing this tech at all?
So, you know, I think the problem right now is probably that we don't have the ability to choose.
Yeah.
That the world is kind of stuck in this configuration where the pace of tech progress is kind of pedal to the metal.
Mm-hmm.
And there isn't really a different setting that we can pick. And even for technologies that we really, really don't want, we actually can't really pick to not get them. Or at least there's this perception in a lot of ways. And um, and I think we allow for the development of technologies like this. You know, I think that we shouldn't develop this technology, and uh, that opposing its development will be one of the most important political fights of the next, decade. And
Wow.
um, uh, I think the world is going to change really dramatically as a consequence of as this technology develops. And I think, especially politically, things are going to be possible that I think people don't expect with technologies like this. I think especially when you get public opposition to a technology, like you saw in 1972 with the combination of 3 Mile Island and the
Mm-hmm.
movie, the movie, The China Syndrome, about a nuclear disaster that was released almost simultaneously. You know, when the public really opposes something, that can really change the direction things are going. And uh, I think I'm unfortunately making a sort of bad bet for me, which is I think if the technology really is as uh, risky as I think it is, then that's kind of unfortunate because we don't want the technology to be very risky. But if it isn't as risky as I think it is, then that's kind of great. But I end up looking a little bit silly.
So if you're in the awkward spot of, if you're wrong, we're all happy,
Yeah, exactly,
right?
exactly.
If you're wrong, like, actually, guys, there was. But also, the super weird thing is, if it's, let's say it's 90-10, or let's say it's 70-30, 70% utopia,
Yeah,
30% death for all. It's most likely going to mean that it looks like, hey, we're all fine. There weren't any risk there.
that's right.
But if there was 30%, that let's go even further. Let's just say 51-49 call, a coin flip. 51% utopia, 49% death to all. If the coin flip happened to go heads, then yay, utopia. We were silly to be worried. but maybe we weren't that silly. Maybe we got very lucky and tails would have killed us all, right? It doesn't mean it was wrong to be concerned about risk. So I think, and I'm just personally, I haven't figured out where I come down on this myself. I am super fascinated, intrigued by all the upside.
Yeah.
I might be one of those sickos who press the button 90-10. I'm not sure. I really might. I might be that. Let's roll the dice. So, but I can also acknowledge that 10% of destroying humanity, it's a pretty big deal. We should really think about this. So I think regardless of where people come down on that risk analysis, you have done an amazing job of articulating what the concerns are, of helping make sense of this. So thank you so much for taking the time to educate myself and the listeners. I think I'm better off for it. I appreciate that. Let's stay in touch. I'll be following your work closely going forward, as I think it's really important. Again, wherever you come down on this debate, the work you're doing is very important. Thank you for helping us all better understand the risks and of this wild and crazy new tech. I appreciate it, Daniel. And really enjoyed having you on.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks a lot, Jeff. This was really fun.
There you have it. Thanks again to Daniel Colson, the Executive Director of the AI Policy Institute. Thank you, dear listener, for being open to considering the kind of more sober and at times chilling side of AI. What's important to grapple with. These are crucial questions to keep in mind going forward as we also get excited about AI. And I will do my best to provide balance in this podcast feed, bringing on different topics and guests that can comment on, the good and the concerning of AI. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to AI Curious at Apple or Spotify or your favorites podcast provider. Oh, and also exciting news. AI Curious is now finally on YouTube as well. By popular demands, we are on YouTube. Shout out to good friend of the pod, Lee Bob Black. Lee, thank you for the YouTube encouragement. Thanks again to all of you. Please rate it 5 stars. Feel free to leave a comment on the YouTube video. Tell me what you think, and we'll see you next time. Take care.